On the morning of April 8, 2026, the air in Riverhead, New York was cold and still. Outside the Suffolk County Courthouse, cameras lined the sidewalks. Families sat in the gallery, some of them having waited for this moment for nearly 30 years. They had flown in from Maine, from Connecticut, from Trinidad and Tobago. They had driven in from the Bronx and from Long Island. They brought photographs. At some point that morning, a 62-year-old man named Rex Heuermann was led into the courtroom. He was tall, heavy. He wore glasses and a suit that did not quite fit his frame. And if you had passed him on the street, if you had ridden the commuter rail with him or waited in line beside him at a sandwich counter in Midtown Manhattan, you would have forgotten him immediately. He sat down. He was asked to confirm his name. He did. Then, one by one, for 8 women, he was asked a single question. 8 times. And 8 times, he said the same word. Guilty. Let that sit for a moment. 8 women, 8 times. One word. And after 30 years, it was supposed to be the end of the story. Stay with me, because the story is not over, and it did not begin in that courtroom. I want to begin with the women, not with Rex Heuermann, not with the evidence or the timeline or the courtroom procedurals. I want to begin with 8 human beings who deserve to exist in your mind as more than names at the bottom of a news alert. Sandra Costilla was 28 years old. She was from Trinidad and Tobago. She had been living in New York City. She was killed in November of 1993. Her body was found by hunters in a wooded area in North Sea, a hamlet in Southampton on Long Island's South Fork. For 31 years, the name of the man who killed her was unknown to the people she left behind. She was the first. And for 3 decades, she was largely invisible to everyone except the people who loved her. Karen Vergata was 34 years old. She left behind 2 sons. Her partial remains were discovered on Fire Island in April of 1996. For more than 25 years, her identity was unknown to investigators. She was catalogued as a Jane Doe, a bureaucratic term for the forgotten. She was identified in 2022. Rex Heuermann admitted to her killing on April 8, 2026. He had not been charged with her death. He volunteered her name. Valerie Mack was 24 years old. She vanished sometime in 2000. She had last been seen by her family in Port Republic, New Jersey. Her remains were found in 2 separate locations, years apart. I will return to that detail. Jessica Taylor was 20 years old when she disappeared in July of 2003, 20 years old. Her mother, Elizabeth Baxkiel, stood outside that courthouse on April 8, 2026, and told reporters, "I am glad that this is over. It took a big chunk of stress off of me and my family." 23 years of waiting. And a big chunk of stress is as close as language can get to what that actually costs a person. Maureen Brainerd Barnes was 25. She had bright blue eyes. She was, by every account of the people who knew her, outgoing in a way that filled a room. She had 2 children. She had been out of sex work for 7 months when she received an eviction notice. She went back to pay her mortgage. She disappeared on July 9, 2007. Her sister, Melissa Cann, stood in that courthouse gymnasium on April 8, 2026 and said, "This has been a long journey of hope. Hope that one day we would stand here and say her name with justice beside it." Melissa Barthélemy was 24. She had a 15-year-old sister named Amanda. After Melissa disappeared, Amanda received phone calls, 5 weeks of them, from a man using Melissa's phone. The calls were taunting, degrading. The man eventually told Amanda that her sister was dead, that he was going to watch her rot. 5 weeks. A 15-year-old girl. Megan Waterman was 22. She had a 3-year-old daughter named Liliana. She had left Liliana with family in Scarborough, Maine, when she came to Long Island in June of 2010. She never came back. On April 8, 2026, Liliana, now a teenager, stood outside the courthouse and said, "I am very, very thankful." Amber Lynn Costello was 27. She was last seen on September 2, 2010, leaving her home in West Babylon. 8 women. Their ages when they died: 28, 34, 24, 20, 25, 24, 22, 27. This video is about them. Everything else, Every piece of evidence, every investigative failure, everything that went wrong for 30 years happened to them. It happened around them. The center of this story is not Rex Heuermann. It is these 8 women. To understand this story, you first need to understand where Rex Heuermann lived, not where he worked, not who he appeared to be in the offices of his Manhattan architectural consultancy, where he spent his days helping developers design buildings and renovate structures across Midtown. You need to understand where he lived and what that means. Rex Andrew Heuermann was born on September 13, 1963, in Massapequa Park, New York. He grew up in a house on First Avenue, the same house that would later become infamous for reasons no one on that block could have anticipated. His father, a World War II veteran and former second lieutenant in the United States Air Force, died in 1975 when Rex was 12 years old. Childhood acquaintances described him as a mama's boy. His mother, by their account, was controlling. He attended Burner High School. He graduated in 1981. He studied architecture at the New York Institute of Technology. By his late 20s, he was working in Manhattan, commuting from the same village where he grew up, the same streets, the same neighborhood. He bought his childhood home. He never left. He married his second wife, Asa Ellerup, in April of 1996. They had 2 children. They lived in that house on First Avenue in Massapequa Park, while Asa and the children, by all available evidence, had no idea what was happening in the room below them. I want to say that again. While Asa Ellerup cooked meals and raised children and went about the business of her life, her husband was, by his own later admission, murdering women and bringing their bodies to a locked basement room in that house. He told investigators that 7 of the 8 murders were committed there. The first, Sandra Costilla, in 1993, was committed before he married Asa in his vehicle and was the only killing he later described as unplanned. His daughter, Victoria, would later tell reporters that her father had always been quiet and gentle at home. His neighbors found him ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of man you nod at and then stop thinking about. To his neighbors, Rex Heuermann was simply the man with the house that never got fixed, the paint that kept peeling, the yard that looked increasingly out of place as the surrounding neighborhood was renovated and improved. He stood 6 feet 6 inches tall. He weighed approximately 270 pounds. He commuted to Manhattan every morning, to an office at 235 Fifth Avenue, where he ran a small architectural consultancy called RH Consultants and Associates. He wore glasses. He carried a briefcase. Nobody looked more closely. Court documents filed after his arrest described what investigators found on his electronic devices: a significant collection of violent, bondage, and torture pornography dating back to at least 1994. Images consistent with how several of his victims had been bound and restrained. Prosecutors described a document found on his devices that they called a blueprint, a written plan he used to organize his killings with what they termed excruciating detail. He had been curating this material for decades, in that house, in the neighborhood where he grew up. He used burner phones, multiple devices, registered under different names, used exclusively for arranging contact with victims. He solicited them through Craigslist and other platforms. He lured each woman with the promise of money. He planned each murder around the schedule of his own household. Investigators confirmed his wife and children were out of state during every single killing. Everyone. He was not a man who committed violence in moments of rage or instability. He was a man who looked at his family calendar and chose his dates accordingly, who returned to his house afterward, who drove back to his office in Manhattan on Monday morning, who did it again. I want to stop here for a moment. What Rex Heuermann exhibited is what criminologists call compartmentalization at a forensic level. The ability to maintain parallel identities so completely separated that neither one contaminates the other. Architects think in systems, in structure, in sequenced, deliberate steps. When that cognitive framework is turned toward violence, it produces something unusually dangerous. Not a killer driven by impulse, but one who designs concealment the same way he designs buildings. Methodically, with attention to the failure points. He identified the failure points in the investigation before the investigation had identified him. He monitored news coverage of the case. He tracked how close investigators were getting. He used different devices for different purposes. He chose victims who existed, by institutional design, in the margins of what the system decides to surveil. And he was right, for 30 years, that those margins would protect him. The fact that he got away with it for 3 decades is not only his doing, it is also ours. I want to go back to the women now, because for most of the history of this case, the story was told in reverse. The bodies first, the names second, the lives almost never. That is a choice I am not willing to make. Maureen Brainerd Barnes had bright blue eyes. She was from Norwich, Connecticut, a small city about 2 hours northeast of New York. She was a mother. She was outgoing. Her friend Sarah Carnes described her as someone who was very alive in a room. She had been out of sex work for 7 months when the eviction notice arrived. I want you to think about that for a moment. 7 months. She had been working her way out. She had a telemarketing job. She was paying her bills. And then a single letter arrived in the mail, and she made a decision that no one who has never faced an eviction notice with 2 children has the right to judge. She went back to make what she needed. One more time. On the night of July 9, 2007, Maureen called Sarah Carnes from a Super 8 motel in Manhattan and said she was going out to meet a client. She said she would call back. She never called back. Shortly after her disappearance, a man called Sarah using a blocked number. He claimed Maureen was alive and staying somewhere in Queens. He said he would call back with an address. Sarah asked him to use a traceable number so the information would be useful to investigators. He said he would. He never called. Investigators later concluded that call was almost certainly Rex Heuermann. He was calling the friends of the women he had killed. He was using their phones to reach the people who loved them, to extend the grief, to make it worse. He did this with Melissa Barthelemy, too, calling her 15-year-old sister over 5 consecutive weeks, using Melissa's phone, telling a teenager that her sister was dead, describing what he had done. 5 weeks, a 15-year-old girl, picking up the phone. Let me be direct with you. The kind of person who does that is not simply committing murder. He is extending it. He is ensuring that the grief of the people left behind is prolonged and degrading in ways that continue for years after the killing itself. Megan Waterman was 22 years old when she left her 3-year-old daughter Liliana with family in Scarborough, Maine, and came to Long Island in June of 2010. Court documents confirmed that Megan was not only a woman who had turned to sex work, she was a victim of sex trafficking. Her boyfriend, who was arrested on trafficking charges in April 2012, had been controlling her movements and her income. She did not come to Long Island freely. She was sent there. 2 forms of violence, 2 forms of exploitation. One 22-year-old woman from Maine with a daughter at home waiting for her. Amber Lynn Costello left her home in West Babylon on the afternoon of September 2, 2010, to meet with a client. An associate who helped her arrange the meeting told investigators afterward that the client had been described as a bulky man, that he drove a Chevrolet Avalanche. That tip, a Chevrolet Avalanche, was written down, filed, and left in a folder for 13 years. Sandra Castillo was 28, from Trinidad and Tobago, living in New York City. She disappeared in November of 1993, and her body was found the following morning by hunters in a wooded area in North Sea, a hamlet in the Hamptons on Long Island's South Fork. For 31 years, her case was never formally connected to the Gilgo Beach killings, until advanced DNA analysis confirmed that hair found near her remains matched Rex Heuermann. He had been killing for at least 30 years before he was caught. 30 years. Valerie Mack's remains were found in pieces. Her partial remains were discovered in Manorville in November of 2000. The remaining portions of her remains were found 11 years later, in April of 2011, along Ocean Parkway, miles away from the first discovery. He had distributed her remains across 2 separate sites that would not be connected for over a decade.
Jessica Taylor was 20 years old. Her partial remains were found in Manorville in July of 2003. Additional remains were found near Gilgo Beach in March of 2011.
I will be honest with you. There is a version of this script that lingers on these details, that uses clinical inventory language to describe the physical evidence the way a forensic report would. I am not going to do that. What I will say is this. Rex Heuermann used a locked room in his own house as the site of deliberate, sustained violence. He strangled his victims. He bound 3 of the Gilgo 4 by wrapping them in burlap at the head, the midsection, and the legs.
He transported their remains across Long Island and disposed of them with the same systematic precision he brought to his architectural work. He designed buildings. He used the same brain to design concealment. And for 30 years, the system let him. Here is the question I need you to sit with before we continue. Between 1993 and 2010, a man murdered 8 women on Long Island. Some of their remains were discovered years after the killings, at multiple scattered locations. Several of them had called friends or family before they disappeared. Several had left digital traces, phone records, motel check-ins, online postings. And yet, for 17 years, not one of these cases was formally connected to a single suspect. The answer to why requires us to say something uncomfortable out loud. Most of these women were sex workers, and for a significant portion of their missing persons investigations, the institutions tasked with finding them did not treat their disappearances with the same urgency that would have been applied to a woman in a different profession, in a different neighborhood with a different kind of life. This is not a theory. It is documented. Robert Kolker, the journalist who wrote Lost Girls, the definitive account of the Gilgo Four, reported that some people inside the Suffolk County Police Department showed contempt for the victims and their families in the years following the 2010 discoveries. Contempt, not indifference, not bureaucratic neutrality. Contempt. For the families of murdered women. That word was chosen carefully by a careful journalist. I need you to hold it. Now I need to tell you about a woman named Shannon Gilbert, because without her, the bodies might still be there. On the night of May 1st, 2010, Shannon Gilbert, a 23-year-old sex worker, disappeared in the Barrier Island community of Oak Beach, New York. She had been visiting a client. At some point during that visit, she became terrified. She ran from the house. She knocked on a neighbor's door. She called 911. The recording of that 911 call, which was not released to the public until May of 2022, 12 years after the fact, runs 22 minutes long. In it, you can hear Shannon telling a dispatcher that people are after her. You can hear something in her voice that is very difficult to describe and impossible to dismiss. And then the call ends. She was never seen alive again. Suffolk County Police began looking for her. In doing so, they found something else entirely. On December 11, 2010, a police officer conducting a K-9 training exercise with his dog along Ocean Parkway found human remains in the brush at the side of the road. They were initially believed to be Shannon Gilbert's. They were not. They were Melissa Barthelomy's. 2 days later, police found 3 more complete sets of remains in the same quarter-mile stretch of road. Amber Lynn Costello, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, 4 women, found within 72 hours of each other, in the same stretch of road, each of them wrapped in burlap. Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Dormer publicly announced on December 14, 2010, that a serial killer was likely responsible. It had taken the disappearance of a woman the police were searching for, not too urgently, to reveal the bodies of 4 women who had been waiting, concealed in the brush along a public road, for somewhere between 2 months and 3 years. Shannon Gilbert's own remains were found 13 months later, in December of 2011, in a tidal marsh near Oak Beach. Suffolk County Police ruled her death an accidental drowning. Her family has never accepted that finding. As of the making of this video, the question of what happened to Shannon Gilbert in the hours between her 911 call and the moment she was found in that marsh has not been fully answered to the satisfaction of the people who loved her. She disappeared searching for something. And in searching for her, investigators found them. By December of 2010, investigators had 4 bodies, the Gilgo Four, each wrapped in burlap, found within the same quarter-mile stretch of the same road, all of them women, all of them with last known contact on Long Island. That is not an ambiguous crime scene. That is an active serial killer, almost certainly still living within a reasonable distance of that road, who had been operating long enough to develop a system, a method, a signature. And yet, the tip from Amber Costello's associate, describing a bulky man driving a Chevrolet Avalanche, was not followed with the urgency it warranted. The task force that should have formed immediately did not form with the resources required. The investigation stalled within months. This is what I need you to understand. It did not go cold because there was no evidence. It went cold because of choices. A series of institutional choices made by individuals in positions of authority about how much resource and attention to allocate to the deaths of women in the sex industry.
Those choices had names on them. And the women who paid for those choices had names too. By the spring of 2011, the number of sets of remains discovered along Ocean Parkway and in the surrounding areas had grown significantly. Among them were the partial dismembered remains of Valerie Mack and Jessica Taylor, whose other body parts had been discovered in Manorville years earlier and never connected to the Gilgo investigation until now. Near the Ocean Parkway site, investigators also found the remains of a toddler, a little girl, later identified through DNA as Tatiana Dykes, the daughter of a woman whose killer, Andrew Dykes, would not be arrested until December of 2025. A toddler. Let that sit for a moment. The years following 2011 were characterized by something that is easy to describe and difficult to defend: institutional paralysis. There were investigations, there were federal briefings, there were criminal profiles suggesting the killer was local, organized, and professional. There were digital forensic tools available that were not fully deployed. And then for years, almost nothing publicly visible happened. Between 2011 and 2022, no suspect was publicly named. There was a period during those years when the Suffolk County Police Department was consumed by its own internal crisis. Its former chief, James Burke, was convicted on federal corruption and obstruction charges in 2016. The organization tasked with finding a serial killer was simultaneously managing the criminal conduct of its own leadership. That is documented fact, not speculation. In January of 2022, the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office convened a new task force to reinvestigate the Gilgo Beach killings. The driving factor was a new police commissioner, Rodney Harrison, a former NYPD chief who arrived with no institutional attachment to the previous investigation's choices and no reason to protect them. 1 month into his tenure, the task force had Rex Heuermann in its sights. 1 month. What happened in that month was this. Investigators went back to the person who had spoken to Amber Costello's last known client and re-examined what he had said. He had described the man as bulky, unusually large, and said he drove a distinctive first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. Investigators ran the vehicle description against registered owners in the areas connected to the case. Rex Heuermann owned a dark green first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. The vehicle had been sitting in a database, attached to his name and his Massapequa Park address, for 13 years. Nobody had checked.
From that single thread, investigators began to pull. They pulled his phone records. They pulled cell tower data showing his location during the periods when the victims disappeared. His phone had placed him in the same geographic areas as the victims' phones at the same moments, a pattern that, taken together, formed what prosecutors would later call an evidentiary backbone. They found something else. His internet search history showed a sustained, deliberate interest in the Gilgo Beach investigation itself. He had been reading everything written about it. He was tracking how close they were getting. He had been doing this for years. In early 2023, investigators placed Rex Heuermann under physical surveillance. Teams of plainclothes officers followed him through the streets of Manhattan. They watched him arrive at his office. They watched him leave. They watched him move through the city he had worked in for 30 years, carrying his briefcase, wearing his glasses, looking like any other unremarkable man on a Manhattan sidewalk. And then, one afternoon, they watched him throw something away. I want to stop here because the Chevrolet Avalanche detail deserves its own moment. In 2010, a witness provided investigators with a physical description of the man last seen with Amber Costello and a specific vehicle he drove. A first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. A distinctive vehicle, not a common make. Not a generic description. That information was entered into the system, filed, and left there. For 13 years, Rex Heuermann drove that truck. He parked it in his driveway. He registered it. He renewed its plates. It existed in every database a law enforcement officer had access to. Nobody pulled the file. Suffolk County District Attorney Raymond Tierney, the DA who eventually brought the case to resolution, said after Heuermann's arrest that the task force did in 18 months what should have been done in 2010. What should have been done in 2010. That is not ambiguity. That is an acknowledgement from the prosecutor himself that the investigation failed, that the right questions were not asked, that the right databases were not searched, that the right person was not identified for over a decade. And during that decade, 3 more women were murdered.
Whether there are victims not yet identified remains an open question. The FBI is still asking. On a day in the spring of 2023, Rex Heuermann stood on the sidewalk outside his office on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan and ate a slice of pizza. He didn't finish it. He threw the box, with the partially eaten crusts still inside, into a sidewalk garbage can. A surveillance team was watching. The moment the box hit the trash, investigators moved. They retrieved the box. They sent it to the crime lab. What they were looking for was DNA. Specifically, they needed to compare Heuermann's DNA to something already in evidence, a male hair found on the burlap wrapping that had been used to bind one of the Gilgo 4 victims. That hair had been sitting in evidence storage for over a decade, waiting for a match. The pizza crust gave them the match. His DNA, her burlap, the same man. I want you to think about what that means. A hair. A single strand of biological material transferred from Rex Heuermann's body to the bindings of a woman he murdered had survived more than a decade in evidence storage. The technology to analyze it had been available for years. The database to compare it against had been available for years. The piece of paper that said re-interview the witness and check the vehicle registration had been available for 13 years. All of it was already there. All it took was someone deciding to look. On the evening of July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann stepped out of his Fifth Avenue office building and walked toward the street. Plainclothes officers were waiting. He was arrested on the sidewalk. He was taken into custody and charged that night with 3 counts of murder in the deaths of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. He was arraigned and held without bail. He entered a single plea: not guilty. His attorney, Michael Brown, told reporters that Heuermann was absolutely not the Gilgo Beach killer, that the evidence was circumstantial, that his client would be vindicated. 2 days after his arrest, crime scene investigators descended on the house on First Avenue in Massapequa Park. They were there for days. What they removed from that house filled box after box: forensic evidence, electronics, weapons, clothing, material consistent with the burlap used in the bindings. A document investigators described as a blueprint, a written plan Heuermann had allegedly used to organize his killings. Evidence connecting Rex Heuermann to the women he had killed, spanning 30 years of meticulous concealment. Asa Ellerup filed for divorce shortly after her husband's arrest. She and her daughter Victoria have stated, through their attorney, that they had no knowledge of or involvement in the killings. I believe her. And I think about what it must mean to have lived in a house with a man who was that person in that room downstairs. To have built your entire life inside those walls and had no idea what those walls contained. Some questions in this case will never be fully answered. That is one of them. The pizza crust is the detail that gets the most attention in this case. It is, genuinely, remarkable. A piece of discarded food containing biological material that matched evidence from a murder committed over a decade earlier. But I need you to sit with a different version of that story. That hair, the one on the burlap, was already there. It had been collected in 2010 or 2011. The forensic infrastructure to extract and compare DNA from hair evidence had existed for years. The lab that processed the pizza crust was not using technology that wasn't available in 2015, or 2012, or 2010. What was not available before 2022 was the willingness to go get the sample. You do not get the DNA match without first deciding that Rex Heuermann is worth surveilling. You do not surveil Rex Heuermann without first going back to re-examine the evidence. You do not re-examine the evidence without first deciding that these cases, these women, are worth the resources required to actually solve them. The pizza crust was not the breakthrough. The decision to look was the breakthrough. Everything else followed from that one institutional choice to take these women seriously enough to start over. Between July 2023 and April 2026, Rex Heuermann maintained his innocence. For almost 3 years, his attorney insisted the evidence was circumstantial. For almost 3 years, the case moved through the legal system. Additional charges filed, additional victims named, the scope of the indictment growing with each new forensic match. In January 2024, he was charged with the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. In June 2024, with the murders of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Costilla. In December 2024, with the murder of Valerie Mack. One by one, their cases were formally connected to the man who had lived in Massapequa Park for 30 years. And then, on the morning of April 8th, 2026, 5 months before his scheduled trial date, Rex Heuermann walked into a Suffolk County courtroom and changed his plea. The hearing lasted approximately 30 minutes. He pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder, 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello, and 4 counts of second-degree murder for the deaths of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Sandra Costilla, Jessica Taylor, and Valerie Mack. He also admitted, in open court, to killing Karen Vergata in 1996. That admission was not accompanied by a formal charge. As part of the plea agreement, the district attorney's office agreed not to charge him with her death separately. He volunteered her name. It was not required of him. He admitted to strangling all 8 women. He admitted to using burner phones to contact them. He admitted to binding 3 of the Gilgo 4 with burlap before disposing of their bodies along Ocean Parkway.
How old are you?
62.
You read and write English?
Yes.
Have you discussed this case with your attorney?
Yes, I have.
Have you had enough time to discuss this case with your attorney?
Yes, I have.
After discussions with your lawyer, you feel it's in your best interest to plead guilty rather than go to trial.
Yes, Your Honor.
Are you satisfied with the manner in which your attorneys represented you in this case?
Yes, I am.
I must say that the attorneys on both sides of this case have been excellent, unbelievable lawyers. Do you understand that by pleading guilty to a charge, that is the same as if you had gone to trial and been found guilty of that charge?
Yes, Your Honor.
Do you understand that by pleading guilty, you're waiving a number of very important rights?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, now these rights include your right to a trial by jury or by the court, your right to have the prosecution produce evidence and witnesses to prove your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, your right to cross-examine those witnesses, and your right to testify on your own behalf or to remain silent, your right to call witnesses or submit evidence on your behalf. Do you understand those rights as I've just explained them?
His
Yes.
attorney, Michael Brown, told reporters outside the courthouse that the decision to plead guilty was, for his client, cathartic to some extent. That Heuermann had wanted to spare the families the ordeal of a trial, that there had been ongoing conversations about saving his family from that. Brown also said there came a point where Rex himself said, "I want to plead guilty. I want to be fair about what that statement contains and what it does not. Spare the families." That phrase carries weight. It is possible that some portion of Rex Heuermann's decision to plead guilty was motivated by something human, by recognition of the suffering extended by a years-long trial. It is also possible that the attorney had concluded the evidence was overwhelming, that a trial would produce the same outcome at far greater cost, and that a guilty plea was the most strategically rational path available to a man who was almost certainly going to prison for the rest of his life regardless. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. In the gymnasium at Suffolk County Community College in Brentwood that afternoon, dozens of family members, law enforcement officials, and journalists gathered for a news conference. Melissa Cann, Maureen Brainerd Barnes' sister, stood at the microphone and said, "This has been a long journey of hope. Hope that one day we would stand here and say her name with justice beside it. Today, that long, painful journey brings us to this moment." Elizabeth Batskill, Jessica Taylor's mother, said, "I am glad that this is over. It took a big chunk of stress off of me and my family." And somewhere in that gymnasium was Liliana, Megan Waterman's daughter, who was 3 years old when her mother left for Long Island and never came back. She is a teenager now. She has grown up in the space her mother should have occupied. District Attorney Raymond Tierney said of Heuermann, "He thought that by killing them he could silence them forever and get away with murder. But he was wrong. He was wrong. It took 30 years to prove it." As part of his guilty plea, Heuermann agreed to cooperate fully with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to help investigators identify other serial killers. His sentencing was set for June 17, 2026. He is expected to receive multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. I want to stop here because the word guilty carries a weight in this case that I do not want to let pass unexamined. In the American legal system, a guilty plea is resolution. It is the closure of a case. It is, in the language of the courthouse, the end. But in the lives of the people in that gymnasium, the people who spent anywhere from 13 to 33 years not knowing the name of the man who had killed their daughter, their sister, their mother, a guilty plea is not the end of anything. It is the end of not knowing. That is different. Not knowing is its own particular form of suffering, one that exists in parallel to the grief, running alongside it, compounding it every day for years, every time a phone rings and it might be news, every time a case update appears and it contains nothing. A guilty plea removes the not knowing.
but it does not remove the years that the not knowing cost. Justice and resolution are not always the same word, and I want to be honest about that. So here is the question that this entire video has been building toward. How does a serial killer operate on Long Island for 30 years? How does a man murder 8 women, across 3 decades, across multiple counties, leaving physical evidence at multiple crime scenes, and remain unidentified and uncharged until he is almost 60 years old? Let me walk you through what was available and when. In 1993, when Sandra Costilla was killed, forensic DNA analysis was in its infancy. That is a genuine limitation. I am not going to pretend it wasn't. In 1996, when Karen Vergata was killed, DNA databases were not what they are today. Also, a genuine limitation. By 2003, when Jessica Taylor disappeared, those limitations had significantly diminished. Forensic DNA had become standard practice. Evidence collection techniques had advanced. The tools existed. By 2007, when Maureen Brainerd Barnes disappeared, those tools were widely deployed in serious homicide investigations. The methodology for connecting serial cases through forensic evidence was well established. In 2010, when the Gilgo Four were found within the same quarter-mile stretch of the same road, wrapped in the same material, connected by the same investigative thread, every tool needed to work this case was available and in use across the country. The vehicle tip was in the file. The hair was in the evidence log. The digital forensics were available. And for 12 years, nothing happened. I want to be precise here because I think precision matters in a case like this. I am not saying that every detective who worked this case was indifferent. I am not saying that every officer who touched this file chose these women's deaths over other priorities. I'm not saying the institution was uniformly, monolithically negligent. What I'm saying is this. The evidence of what happened is not ambiguous. A tip sat in a file for 13 years. A task force formed in early 2022 identified the primary suspect within weeks. After 12 years of official investigations, press conferences, federal briefings, and criminal profiles, a new commissioner arrived, formed a new task force, and the man who had killed 8 women across 30 years was identified in a matter of weeks. That is not a vindication of the system. That is an indictment of what the system chose to prioritize in the years before. I want to talk directly to you now, not about Rex Heuermann, not about the evidence, or the task force, or the pizza crust. I want to talk about something that is harder to quantify and harder to dismiss than any piece of forensic evidence in this case. 8 women were murdered. The oldest of them was 34, the youngest was 20. The span of their deaths runs from 1993 to 2010, 17 years. During those 17 years, families filed missing persons reports, investigators opened files, evidence was collected and cataloged and stored in rooms that nobody went back into for years. Most of those 8 women were sex workers. I want to say that clearly, and then ask you what I believe is the central question of this entire case. Would those files have sat unopened for 13 years if the women in them had held different jobs? I think you already know the answer. I think you knew it before I asked. The research on this is not ambiguous. In study after study on missing persons cases in the United States, the profession of sex work is correlated with longer investigation timelines, lower conviction rates, and less media coverage than missing persons cases involving women in other professions. This is not a fringe observation. It is documented in criminological research, in journalism, in the congressional testimony of advocates who have spent decades trying to change it. Robert Kolker, who spent years reporting on this case, has said that what the Gilgo Beach investigation revealed was not simply one man's capacity for violence. It revealed a structural assumption, embedded in institutional practice, that some women's disappearances are more urgently worth investigating than others. That assumption has a cost. That cost is counted in years, in additional murders that might not have happened if the investigation had moved faster, in decades of not knowing for the families of Sandra Costilla and Karen Vergata, in Liliana Waterman growing up without her mother. Now I want to say something that I think is important and that I do not think gets said clearly enough in the coverage of this case. Rex Heuermann chose these women deliberately. He chose them, by his own description in court documents, because he believed they were in a profession that would make them harder to find and harder to advocate for. He understood the institutional blind spot. He relied on it. He planned around it. He was right. He was right for 30 years. And the question of what we owe, as a society, to the women who paid for that institutional blind spot with their lives, that is not a question that ends with a guilty plea in a Riverhead courthouse. It is a question that is still open. It is a question that requires something from all of us. Suffolk County District Attorney Raymond Tierney has publicly committed to an investigation into the systemic failures that allowed this case to stall for over a decade. What that investigation produces, what accountability it establishes, what changes it recommends, will determine whether the lesson of this case is learned or simply filed away. I hope it is learned. I hope it is learned for Maureen, for Melissa, for Megan, for Amber, for Jessica, for Valerie, for Sandra, for Karen. 8 women, 30 years. One word that came way too late. Before you leave, I want to say their names one more time, not as a procedural list, not in the order they appear in court documents, but as what they were. Sandra Costilla, 28 years old, from Trinidad and Tobago. She came to New York to build a life. She was killed in November of 1993. For 31 years, her family waited. They waited longer than anyone. They deserve to be named first. Karen Vergata, 34 years old, a mother of 2 sons. She disappeared in 1996 and was known only as a Jane Doe for more than 25 years. He volunteered her name in a courtroom on April 8, 2026. She had been waiting the second longest. Valerie Mack, 24 years old, from New Jersey. Her remains were separated across 2 counties and found 11 years apart. She was not allowed the dignity of being found whole. She deserved better than what was done to her, and better than what was done in the years after. Jessica Taylor, 20 years old, the youngest. Her mother has been waiting since 2003. She got a big chunk of stress taken off in a courthouse in April of 2026. 23 years of that wait. I cannot imagine what it weighs. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25 years old, bright blue eyes, 2 children. 7 months out of sex work when the eviction notice came. Her sister Melissa stood in a gymnasium and said her name with justice beside it. That moment was earned by years I will not pretend to fully understand. Melissa Barthélemy, 24 years old. Her 15-year-old sister Amanda picked up the phone for 5 weeks because she believed someone on the other end had information about where Melissa was. Amanda is in her early 30s now. She has lived with what she heard on those calls for her entire adult life.
Megan Waterman, 22 years old. She had a daughter named Liliana who was 3 when she left. Liliana is a teenager now. She stood outside a courthouse and said she was very, very thankful. She has been living inside the shape of her mother's absence for her entire conscious life. Amber Lynn Costello, 27 years old, the last. A witness described the man she was last seen with. A vehicle, a description, a tip that waited 13 years in a folder. She deserved better than a folder. They all deserved better. We cannot give them that. We cannot give them back the years or the justice that should have come sooner or the ordinary lives that were taken from them. But we can do what Melissa Can asked us to do in that gymnasium on April 8, 2026. Keep going. Your loved ones matter. They are not forgotten, and one day answers can come. We can remember them. We can say their story out loud. We can refuse to let the institutional blind spot that protected Rex Heuermann for 30 years be filed away as a footnote in a case that has been resolved. It has not been resolved. It has been closed. That is different. The resolution is still ours to make.